Hi, I'm Pat Arrabito, executive producer of the Seventh Day series. I married Jim Arrabito back in 1976. Over the next 7 years, we had 4 children, Tony, Joey, Adel, and Andy. Jim did artwork for a living, but he loved evangelism. And he began to put together a series of Bible studies on history using visuals that he had collected and sharing those in people's homes. Eventually, we ended up sharing in a lot of churches, and we moved into a 35-foot fifth wheel. We had our first 2 sons then, Tony and Joey. When we moved out 3.5 years later, we had 4 children, and we all fit, amazingly. In 1977, when our first son was just 6 months old, Jim took his first trip overseas to collect photographs for his presentations. Joe Maniscalco, who had been his art teacher in college, had introduced him to the whole area of symbolism in religion and in religious art. And so that's what he was collecting over there. He put together a program we entitled 666 and the Mark that traced the history of symbolism in religion. Eventually became the first videotape that he did. In 1984, 1985, somewhere in there, Jim was doing a presentation in Southern California, and a gentleman from Australia happened to be there. Carl Branster had a ministry where he videotaped evangelists here in the U.S., and then he'd take it over to Australia and show it. And he was pretty excited about the material that Jim was sharing and invited him to come to Australia. The 2 programs that he showed there were 666 and the Mark and one on the history of the Jesuits. Carl videotaped those and called them the Z tapes. It was kind of mysterious, and they went like wildfire all over Australia. And that really launched us in the whole idea of putting Jim's programs on videotape and distributing them that way. Somewhere along the way, a friend of ours, Ralph Moss, introduced us to a book that traced the Sabbath through history. We had never heard these things before. We were shocked. Jim and I were both raised Sabbath keepers, but I'd never heard that St. Patrick was a Sabbath keeper. I'd never heard that the Sabbath was an issue in the schism between the Greek and the Latin churches. And so Jim began to research and include these things in his evangelism. And the people that heard it were just as interested as we were. I think it was in 86 or early 87, Jim was back in Australia again doing more meetings, and he gave voice to an idea that had been fermenting in his brain for a while. He wanted to produce a professional documentary that traced the history of the Sabbath. We have that on video, what he said, but the quality is pretty poor, so let me read it to you. Here's what he said. I have a dream. I want to travel the whole world. And I want to go to every place in the world where the Christians down through the ages kept the Sabbath and had their centers and their colleges and their towns and their cities. Even those places that were wiped clean by the Roman Church and repopulated. You can find it in the records. You can find the records of the Inquisition. You can know where God's people once were. I'm going to fit this whole program together in a fast-moving, hard-hitting documentary to show the places where God's people lived, where they suffered, and where they died, and where they passed on the torch of truth to every country in the world. And nothing in the world is going to stop me. Jim began to plan his first trip for the summer of 1987. He'd go to Britain, Europe, and Egypt. A friend of ours had promised to send $6,000 to help with the expenses of this trip. But the weeks and the days passed by and the money hadn't arrived. And it came right up to the day before they were to leave early the next morning. The money still hadn't arrived. Banks closed at 4 o'clock. And we were on our knees. We thought it would be impossible now to get that money. And they really had no money for their expenses once they got overseas. So the phone rang, and it was a local friend. They said, well, did you get your money yet? I said, nope, it's not here. They said, well, we're coming up right now, and we have $6,000 cash for you to take on your trip. And when you get your money, you can pay us back. So we praised God, and they had the money for their trip. Took 3 people with him to begin with. There was Mike Nelson, our computer friend. Eric Beckman was a fisherman from up in Washington who had heard about the project and wanted to be a part of it. And then Bert Morrison came from Australia. He'd been producing some material over there. So he was the cameraman for the trip. Christianopoulos joined them in Greece then later on, and the other three guys went home. Syria was one of those places Jim wanted to go because there were these cities built out along the old trade routes that had been built by the early Christians. He wanted to see those. He made arrangements for a guide to travel from Lebanon and meet him, but when he got there, the guide was not there, and he discovered that he had gone to Damascus instead of Aleppo. So he wasn't sure what to do and how to get where he needed to go, and he talked to a young man that worked in his hotel, a university student, and the young man said, well, my friends and I will take you there. So the next morning, he had assembled a group of friends, and they hired taxis and drove out into the desert where these old cities were, silent cities of Syria. They had a great time together. It happened to be Ramadan. And of course, during Ramadan, the Muslims don't eat during the day, eat at night. So they stopped at a restaurant, and some of the young men ordered food. Some of them were eating and some weren't. And when the food came to Jim, he said, thank you, but I respect your customs, and I'm going to fast today because of Ramadan. Immediately, a young girl, one of the university students, said, ha, he's a better Muslim than you are, she said to her friends. And it kind of opened the way for Jim to be able to talk to her. And as they traveled, he talked to her about his God, his Allah. And he explained to her that he had a personal relationship with God, and that he talked to him and prayed to him, and that God guided him and spoke to him in his life. And the girl seemed to just be in amazement. Her name was Najud, and she asked a lot of questions. The next morning, when the students picked him up again, Najud came to him and she said, I went to the mosque last night and I talked to God. And she seemed really pleased that she had a different view of God than she had had before. When Jim left, Najud told him, you are my teacher and Allah sent you. She wrote to us several times after that, and in one letter, she explained to him the change in her own heart. She said, my family thinks I'm crazy because I just want to do good to people now, and I want to be kind, and I don't want to pay back when they're mean to me, and I just want to give all the time, and my family does not understand me. India was another place Jim wanted to go, partly because of the history of Thomas. The Indian people believe that the Apostle Thomas was the first Christian to come to India, and that he taught the Indian people about God. So when he was there, he wanted to meet the head of the St. Thomas Christian Church, a man named Mar Abram, who incidentally was educated in Britain. Spent a little time with Mar Abram, and he didn't himself know anything about the Sabbath history of the St. Thomas Christians, but he was an interesting character, and he gave Jim a stack of books that he had written on the history of the Nestorian Christians in India. And he also got out his sitar and played jingle bells for him. Another place he wanted to go in India was Goa, where the Portuguese Inquisition came in the 17th century. They were really looking for Jewish Christians, but they found among the population of India Sabbath keepers as well, and persecuted them. And he really wanted to go to the site of the old church, St. Mary's, behind which the stake was set up, and many of those St. Thomas Christians were burned along with all of their writings. It was interesting because they found among them a liturgy that went back to the 3rd century and had not changed in all those years. Jim wanted to go to Russia, Siberia, Ukraine, those areas, because there was a lot of history of Sabbath there. From the 12th and 13th century on, there had been what they called Strigelniki, who were a Sabbath-keeping sect. And of course, there was a reform movement in the Orthodox Church as well. The only time he could schedule to go there was November, which he knew was going to be a little tricky because of weather. And, you know, in every trip, weather could be a problem, and he was always praying that God would clear the skies. When he got to Moscow, it had been snowing, but it made for some gorgeous pictures of St. Basil's there in Red Square. When his flight landed in Yerevan in Soviet Armenia, the weather was horrible. It was pouring rain. The clouds were just dark and oppressive, and he only had the one day there. He knew if it didn't clear up, he wouldn't get what he needed. And he was after photographs of the patriarchate of the old Armenian church in Echmiadzin. So he prayed all the way from the plane to the car rental place By the time he actually got in his car and was pulling out, God had cleared the skies, the rain had gone away, and it was a beautiful day. And these are some of the pictures that he took there. You know, China was closed for tourism for many years, but Jim was eager to get in there, and he told our travel agent, John, that as soon as China opened up for tourism, please book him. So John called one day and said that there was a tour going across the old Silk Road across China, and there was an opening in it if Jim wanted to go. Of course, he did. So he called some friends who were eager to go too and arranged that 4 of them would take this tour. Now, I don't remember exactly how much it cost, but he needed to have $1,800 down to begin with. And John told him the date that money was due. And of course, Jim was an artist. We never had any extra money. But we watched God provide all the way along. And the day the money was due, this guy came into the studio and kind of wandered around and looked at things and asked a few questions. And at some point, Jim explained the whole project and what he was doing. And the guy said, "Oh, it's interesting." And he left. Well, a couple hours later, he came back and he handed Jim this huge roll of bills. And it was $2,400. So we hopped in the car immediately and drove down to the travel agent, and Jim peeled off $1,800 of it. And then he said to John, "Well, I've got $600 more. You want to keep that toward the next installment that's due?" And John said, "No, when the time comes, you'll have the money." And we did. So the people that went on this tour were a young man named Stanley Kaler, who was a college student and eager to see the world. And his grandma was interested in him seeing the world too, so she helped pay for his way. Larry Oster came from Washington. He was a businessman. And then John Wolfe was a businessman from Australia who met them there and went on the tour with them. When the tour group arrived in Beijing, the demonstrations were taking place in Tiananmen Square. In fact, Jim hired students out of the square to take him around. And it was only 2 or 3 weeks after they left when the massacre took place there. You might remember Xi'an as being the place where that whole army of terracotta soldiers was unearthed a few years ago. The place Jim wanted to see in Xi'an was the Forest of Tablets. In that museum was a monument they call the Nestorian Monument Stone. It's about 9 feet tall. That monument was set up outside the gate of the capital city by order of the emperor to commemorate the coming of the Christian missionaries from Palestine, bringing with them the luminous religion. When he got to that museum, there was some little stores outside, and he went up to one of them looking for a rice rubbing of the characters on that stone. When the young man that was the proprietor of that little store heard what he was looking for, he got all excited and he said, "Do you know that that monument is the most important monument in Chinese history? Because it tells about Christianity." And then it was Jim's turn to be really shocked that this young person in a communist country would have placed such value on a Christian monument. He was able to go in and take pictures. And by the way, that man had 1 rice rubbing left of that monument stone that he was able to buy. And here's that very rice paper rubbing that Jim bought from that vendor at the museum. The tour group was following the old Silk Road across the desert in China. Jim had read that in the city of Gaocheng out in the Gobi Desert, there had been found this mural that depicted a Christian teaching people, and he wanted to find the place. When they got there, they didn't have very much time, so he and Stanley took off running to see if they could find this building. And you can tell by the pictures that really it's just ruins. It looks like mounds of sand almost, where all these buildings had been weathered by desert winds ever since they had been abandoned. So they ran around the city and through the city, didn't find it. The tour group was eager to be on their way, but he was eager to find it, and he didn't want to leave till he found it. So they ran again, and finally, on the outside of the wall of the city, they found this little rounded building, and when they went inside, they realized that this was the place where the mural had been found. I think the original mural is in France now in a museum, but here's what it looks like. On the way, their train was stopped by a horrible sandstorm, probably the same kind of storm that's blown across that Silk Road for centuries. The wind was so bad it actually blew rocks right through the windows of the train. Another place they stopped along the way was Dunhuang. It's called the Cave of 1,000 Buddhas. And it's a series of caves in the stone cliffs. In early 1900s, they found thousands of manuscripts in these caves, and among them were some Christian manuscripts. There was a piece of the Gospel of John, there was something called the Hymn of the Trinity, and some other materials, and he was real eager to see these caves. The tour group traveled across the Taklamakan Desert to the city of Kashgar, where the Uyghur people had this huge bazaar where they were selling everything from interesting food to camels. They were having horse races there, and Jim managed to get himself mounted on this fidgety, skinny little horse that took off like wolves were after it, and he barely was able to make it back. And of course, his tour guide was very upset with him and afraid that he would have lost his life. She was glad to see him alive when he got off. The tour guide there in China was a young woman named Do. She was a staunch member of the Communist Party, and when she learned that Jim and his 3 friends were Christians, she made it plain right away that she was not interested in hearing anything about Christianity. The group had to spend hours in buses and trains going across China, and while they sat there, Jim decided he would help Do with her English. So he said, "Come and sit by me and I'll tell you some stories and I'll help you with your English." So as they rode along, bumping along the roads, he told her stories. He told her the prodigal son. He told her the loaves and the fishes. He told her some of the character-building stories from those old True Education readers. And somewhere along the way, she said, "Where do you hear these stories? They touch my heart." He also had with him a book entitled Christ's Object Lessons, and knowing that she didn't want to hear anything about God, every time she'd come near him, he'd stick it inside his coat and he'd say, "You don't want to hear about that book, it's a Christian book." Well, by the end of the tour, when she asked him about those stories, he said, "Well, some of them come from that book that I was reading." She came to him later then and asked him if he would give her his book. So he did. He left that marked up copy of Christ Object Lessons with her there in China. And later, she wrote us a letter and thanked him again for giving her that book. From Western China, the tour boarded a bus to go up through the Himalayas. They were going through the 16,000-foot Karakoram Pass. Snow had fallen and filled the road with snow, and at one point the bus could go no further. They had some jeeps, and Stanley, being a great driver, ended up ferrying people back and forth from the bus over the snow till they could catch a bus on the other side. They're going over to Taxila in northern India. Taxila is known as a place where every year thousands of people gather to commemorate the coming of Thomas, the first apostle, to India. There were a couple of times when Jim was traveling where he was in dangerous situations, and we could see that God preserved his life. One of them when he was trying to get into Soviet Armenia, and it was hard to get to, and when he finally was able to book a flight, for some reason he wasn't allowed to fly. And the very next day when he would have been there was when that terrible earthquake shook that part of the world. The other time also had to do with Armenia, and it was in Turkish Armenia. He and Christianopoulos were driving far out into the country. It was night, it was late, and they'd been driving for a long day. And they came around a corner and realized too late that they were going much too fast and the corner was too sharp. And the road just cut off into a deep cliff down into a riverbed on one side. And Jim said that the car was sliding and there was no way they could control it, and they knew they were going right off that cliff. And all of a sudden it was like a giant hand just shoved the car and held it right back on the road. And they were safe. They stopped the car and both prayed because they knew that God had preserved their lives. Iraq was another place that didn't feel real safe. When Jim got there, he felt such oppression. And, it was another place where it was hard to get to. And he had told the travel agent, as soon as Iraq opens up for travel, let me in. So he got there, he hired a taxi driver to take him out to the ruins of old Babylon. And in the car, the driver opened up and talked to him about how much they hated Saddam Hussein and how everyone lived in such horrible fear. And even as he talked, he would glance around and then lower his voice as though he himself were afraid of being heard. When it came time to leave, Jim got to the airport and he was not allowed to board his plane. And they said, "You're supposed to have confirmed your flight 4 days in advance," which would have, been about the time he got there before. And they would not let him board the plane. He ended up having to buy a new ticket to even leave. And he said he could hardly wait to get out of there for the oppression. And it was just 3 weeks later that Iraq invaded Kuwait. You might wonder where all the money came from to do the travel and all this production stuff. And I can tell you it was a struggle for us. In the early years, Jim was doing artwork and, it was feast or famine. Painting might sell, it might not. And in that experience, we learned that God always provides for us. Once he started working toward the Sabbath production, he was doing a lot of evangelism. So he was still doing artwork to make a living, but he was gone a lot doing evangelism. And he often struggled, knowing that if he could do artwork full time and really get into the art world, that he had enough of a talent that he could probably make a lot of money. And he would feel so responsible that he needed to be providing better for the family and that he needed to be able to make more money for this project. And yet at the same time, he really believed that if he was invited to do evangelism anywhere, that he should go, that was God's call to him. And so he was on the road a lot. And there were times, one time he was invited to go to New Zealand and Australia and do some evangelism. And it was right while he was getting ready to go to China, and he was trying to raise money for that trip. And he struggled with whether he should go or whether he should stay home and raise money, but he had a hard time saying no to an invitation. So we prayed about it, and he ended up going to New Zealand and Australia. He did meetings there. And just before he was to come home, a person at one of the meetings came up to him and handed him an envelope, and inside was $6,000, which went a long way toward the money that he needed for that trip. And again, it was another evidence that God would provide. All along the way, God has sent people that have been supportive and that have thrown themselves into this project and been a part of it. The late Dr. Richard and Marie Lukens, from the very beginning, offered Jim space to have his studio in. Marie would come down almost every day and pray with us. She was always so interested in what we were doing, and they helped financially as well. Mike Nelson, the computer guy, and new editing equipment and helped select all the equipment and dream the dreams right along beside Jim. David Holmes was a young Welshman who had found Christ in Australia. He came over here to go to school, and he was real excited about the project. He wanted to come help with research. He's a great photographer, did some photography in Britain and in Armenia for us, and also just helped with the research for Britain. There was Catherine Searing, who had had a little background in video work, who worked with us for a while. The late Jeannie Weigel, an elderly woman from Bakersfield, drove her big motorhome up here and parked it outside, came in and answered the phone, did the mailing, and added a great sense of humor. She was just such an interesting and lively lady. In 1989, Cindy came out here from Three Angels Broadcasting Network to be our first employee. Everyone else had been volunteers so far. Cindy arrived just in time to go up to Alaska with Jim, and she manned the camera while he did interviews with the people up there on the story of Manilik. Elder Norman Doss and his wife Florence are another couple of people that have been really important to this project. My son Joey wanted to be baptized, and he began praying that God would send a pastor, because our church was between pastors at the time. God sent Norman Doss, and he became very interested in what Jim was doing. He became so supportive. He would bring people in that he thought should know about it, and became part of our prayer team for the whole project. And he's remained a close friend and supporter all these years. The Sabbath Project kind of took on a life of its own. When Jim was first thinking about it, I remember hearing him say, "I can be done in 6 months and for $10,000. But of course, it became much more than that. And when we began to realize the scope of Sabbath history and how much there was to it, and when we were on our knees constantly praying for God to provide the means and open the doors, eventually we began to look at each other and just laugh and say, this is way too big for us. When it's done, we'll know who did it. During the summer of 1990, Jim began to storyboard the project. Now, he hadn't had a computer where he filed information. He had made notes and drawn little pictures, but mostly it was in his head. And over a period of 2 weeks, he drew a graph with about 560 little pictures in it, depicting the people and the places, the events, the order of everything. And he coded them all by color according to what was location footage, what was a dramatic scene, what was a piece of artwork. And he ended up going over that storyboard with the people that worked with him several times. This storyboard really became the map of his vision for the Sabbath series. Many of you have asked me about the production entitled Maybe on Sunday. During the summer of 1990, Jim traveled to Europe and worked with Carl Branster and Discovery Television to produce that series. It's the story of a man in Australia who supposedly gets caught breaking a Sunday law and goes into some of the history of religious legislation and religious persecution in Europe. Unfortunately, Jim would not be around to see the completion of that project. Just a few weeks after Jim got back from Europe, there in 1990, he got a call from our friends Roger and Diane Merrill in Alaska, reminding him that he needed to come up and finish filming for the Menelik story before the snows came. He was fortunate to have enough mileage on his travel bank to take our two oldest sons with him. Tony was 13, Joey was 11, and it was the dream of their lives to go to Alaska and see bears and elk and moose and get to fish in the rivers and meet the people of Alaska. So they were really excited that they could go with them. For 10 days up there, they did all those things. Jim interviewed some of the people there and took some more footage from the areas where Menelik had lived. On Sunday, September 2, Jim and Tony and Joey and Beth Wainwright, a young student from New Zealand, boarded the Merrill Cessna with Harry Uglywook, the pilot, to head out from Kotzebue down to Anchorage. They were scheduled to catch a flight out of Anchorage into LA early on Monday morning. The day wore on, and as evening came, a storm blew up. And evidently, the plane was blown off course. It was quite late. Harry radioed in for IFR clearance about 11:30 or 11:45 that night. Evidently, he knew he was in trouble and he wanted to get up above the storm. That was the last contact that anyone had with the plane. At home, I put the kids to bed, canned some pears, and then gone to bed, woke up Monday waiting to hear from them that they had landed in LA. We had sent David Holmes down to pick them up. The kids and I were waiting at home for a phone call that they had landed. David did call, but what he said was that they didn't seem to be on the plane and that their names weren't even on the passenger list. So that was kind of shocking to me, and I picked up the phone then and called the Merrills up in Alaska. And that's when I found out that their plane had never even landed in Anchorage. You can imagine the shock that was. So I called the kids in from outside where they were playing, and we knelt down and prayed for the safety of our family. And we had been praying every day that they would return safely and that they would be kept safe while they were up there. That night when I went to bed, I was praying, and I really believed that Jim's work wasn't done yet, and that if their plane had been forced to land, that they were all okay, because God had led so far and he'd made it obvious that he wanted this work done. But when I went to bed, I prayed and I asked God to talk to me, give me some words. And the verse that I came to was in Job, and it was chapter 23, verse 10. The verse that says, "I know the way that you take, and when I have tried you, you shall come forth as gold." And I remember thinking, I wonder why God would say that to me. Maybe it's just a trial to not know. Tuesday morning, I heard from Search and Rescue that they were out looking. They hadn't been able to do much on Monday because of bad weather. And my brother also is a pilot, and so he was keeping in touch with them as well. All day long, my house was filling up with people because they'd heard the news and everyone wanted to wait there with me. Early in the afternoon, I had another call that search and rescue had spotted the plane and they were sending a helicopter in. I called my brother and he said, well, he would call them and find out what was up. He called me back a little bit later and he said, I'm going to fly over and be with you when you get the news. He lived in Sacramento and he had his own plane. In the meantime, my dad was there, Elder Doss, our other pastor, Elder Rich, and quite a few friends. Dad went up to the airport, I don't know if it was a half an hour, 45 minutes, an hour later to pick my brother up. And he brought him home, and when Tom got to the door, he took me by the hand and walked me outside. And he put his arms around me and my dad, and he said, there are no survivors. And for me, it was like there was no world or no time or no nothing. The words just kept going around and around in my head, and I didn't even know how long I was out there. Finally, someone came and said, the kids are getting kind of restless. So I went back in the house, and Andy just ran to me with this accusing look on his face, and he said, my daddy's dead, isn't he? And then Adel came and she said, and how about Tony and Joey? And even if I'd said no, it was too true. How could I say no? And I felt like we were this one little blob of intense agony in this huge universe. And all around, everyone was experiencing it. We were all in agony. And yet, even in the midst of that, there was a sense of God's presence. And it was almost like, where could God be when something like that happens? But rather, it was like God was right there, and it was his agony too. And I had a sense of his presence and of his suffering. And it was his loss, not just ours. It wasn't too much longer, and Adel said, boy, Mom, I'm sure glad you're not the kind of person that blames God for everything. She was almost 9. Andy was 7. At the same time, I think maybe Andy was blaming God for everything. He had such a different perspective. We're all so different. As parents, we try so hard to raise our children without damage and without having to suffer pain in this world. And yet, it happens. And I found that God is sufficient, that he has to be sufficient, and he has to be enough for us and for our children in this life of sorrow. There's been a lot of speculation through the years about the cause of the crash and about whether there was foul play involved. I have the NTSB reports, the FAA reports, which say that it was bad weather and pilot error. And there is no evidence that there was any foul play involved. And I would not ever want to give the impression that God is not able to take care of his people against evil forces in this world. I believe that God allowed it. For what purpose, I don't know, but I believe that God is good and that he only means good for us, and that everything that he allows to come to his people in the world is only for the purpose of ultimate good. And the question for me never was why it happened to me, but the question always was, do I trust God or do I not? And I choose to trust him in this. I believed with all my heart that God would yet accomplish the Sabbath project, that he wanted it done. And I believe that he had people who knew how to do it. We were kind of a insecure, scared, worried little group of people after this. And yet all of us determined to work on it and see that it got done. Bert Morrison came over from Australia. He had traveled with Jim on that first trip and on another trip as well. He had just been diagnosed with ALS. And before he died, he wanted to make sure that it was still going to get done. And incidentally, he did pass away immediately after he returned to Australia. John Wolfe also came over from Australia and spent months here helping us. It was hard to carry on. For months, I stayed home with my children. Mike and David and Blair Andrew, another friend, came from Australia. Cindy, Buffy, Jeannie worked in the studio. They continued working on plans for sets. They started to work on the research. Unfortunately, Jim had all the research in his head. He hadn't filed any of it in the computer. He had scattered notes and pictures that he had drawn. His photographs were not labeled. So over the course of the next several years, people that had traveled with him came and identified as many of the photographs as possible. We still have a lot that are not identified. I had been homeschooling our 4 children during this time and not actively involved in the production or in the process. And besides that, I didn't feel like I have the kind of talents that Jim had. He was visual, he was imaginative, he could see how it all could be done. And I don't feel that I had those kind of gifts. But I felt that there were things that I could do. And while I prayed that God would send people who knew how to do this project, I could begin on research. I could go through the storyboard and pick the people and the events and the places. I could find the information. I could file the documentation. And that's what I began to do, maybe 6 months or so after the plane crash. In 1991, we incorporated it as a nonprofit corporation using the name LLT Productions. Jim had chosen that, and it came from the motto that the Waldenses used, Lux lucet in tenebris, which means the light shines in darkness, taken from John 1:5. 1 year after the plane crash, our volunteers had gone on to other things. Cindy and I were left, just the 2 of us, still praying that God would send people who knew how to produce this properly, and also praying that God would send an office manager. Robert Williams was a sailor who had ordered materials from LLT to show on board the aircraft carrier. We met him at a ministries convention, and he was real excited to meet us because he had so many of our tapes and had so much fun showing them to people. When he was discharged late in 91, he came by here to visit us. We told him of our need and our prayer, and he was very interested and joined us as the office manager. That was over 15 years ago, and he's still here. A couple years later, Robert Daniel Mallisism joined us as an engineer, and Steve Astounded also came on board to work on research and scripting. Jim had always wanted to produce a video about the Waldenses, and he had shot a lot of footage from northern Italy when he was over there. The late Joe Maniscalco, who was an artist and been a friend of ours all through the years, offered to write the script for it. Cindy did the production. The Israel of the Alps was great practice for it. We were able to use some of the sets that we had built and also the new equipment that had gotten set up. With all of the nice footage that we had from Alaska, Cindy was able to produce a video about Manilik, just entitled Manilik the Eskimo Prophet. And amazingly, we were even able to use some of the video footage that was recovered from the plane crash. Seven years passed, and the Sabbath video still wasn't done. I know a lot of people were discouraged. Sometimes they'd ask me if it was ever get done, or sometimes they would say it's never going to get done. But I knew that God was going to do it. During that time period, I was going through the storyboard, and I was finding the stories that were on there. I was finding documentation for those stories, and it was a very tedious process. I'd read a book about Patrick, for example. Then I'd find the footnotes in those books or the sources in that book, and I'd find those books and read, their sources, and then I'd find the sources from that book. And so it was like going through layers and layers and layers of research. The Pacific Union College Library worked with me and got me probably hundreds of books from other libraries that weren't readily available here. In fact, a lot of the books were old and they were rare, and we photocopied those so that we could have our own sources right here to research in. And I built up a library of hundreds of books just on subjects related to Sabbath history that we used for our research. All through those years, we prayed daily for God to guide. And a lot of times when I was researching, I'd have trouble finding something, and I'd be searching and searching and not figuring out what this story was or why it was where it was in the storyboard. And yet, as I moved along, I would come across something that would be a clue to it. And over again, I saw God, bring the pieces together and make a whole out of it. By 1998, I had written a rough draft of a script for the whole thing, beginning to end. It was laid out in 4 parts, and it was almost 200 pages, and it had literally hundreds of footnotes in it. And many of those footnotes had 8 or 10 sources even. I mean, I put everything in there that I found. I had run into Dr. Gerard Domsteeg at General Conference in Holland, and he had been using the Israel of the Alps for his Great Controversy tours and really appreciated it. When I told him about this project, he was real interested, and he offered to be sort of a scholar for the project and to review all of our sources in our script. So I began sending him parts of the script as they were finished, and he would go through them, read them, and then what he did for me was not only teach me how to punctuate all my footnotes properly, he corrected everything so that it would be scholarly and properly done. And then he also let me know if any of my areas of research were weak, if any of the sources were weak, or if there were areas that needed to be documented that I hadn't included documentation for. So the scripts went back and forth between him and me over a period of a couple of years there, where he would send me some ideas and corrections, and I would go to work on it and then send it back to him. And his help was just incredibly invaluable for us. I also ended up sending the script to several people that I thought would be helpful, people in the production world. And mostly what I heard back from them was way too long. Well, I knew I didn't know how to write a script. So one of my prayers all during this time was that God would send someone who knew how to write a script properly. Sometime in '98, Alan Reinach called me. He's a friend of mine and was also a religious liberty director for the Pacific Union. And he asked me if I had let Jeff Wood read the script. Jeff Wood was an Adventist producer, done a lot of work for the Adventist Media Center and a lot of secular work too. And I had known him a little bit from the past. I said, no, I hadn't sent it to him. He's a busy guy. But Alan said, well, give it to me and I'll give it to him. So I sent him a piece of it. And it wasn't too much later that I got a call from Jeff. He'd taken a look at it and he wanted to talk about it. So one of the first things he asked me was how I felt about having a writer work on it, which was really exactly what I wanted. Jeff suggested his brother, Jim Wood, to write the script. So the 3 of us met together and did a lot of talking and brainstorming about approaches, and we ended up agreeing to work on it together. I asked Jeff at one point to give me a rough idea of budget on it, and he said, well, I think it's $1 million project. And I was so happy to hear that, because I didn't want someone to just look at it and think it was unimportant to do it well. And I loved that Jeff could see a vision for how we wanted it done and how it should be done, and it should be done in a manner worthy of the subject. Ultimately, we revised our approach, made it a 5-part series, and set a budget of $3 million for it. Let me tell you a little bit about the process of developing and writing the script. Jim Wood is a writer. He also pastored for a number of years. He took my basic scripts as the start, and from those, he arranged an outline in 5 parts that would cover everything that we wanted to include. Then he started on part 1, wrote a rough draft of a script, and then sent that to Jeff and me. That draft of a script then formed the basis from which he actually wrote a script. We often went through as many as 25 revisions, and whatever ideas Jeff and I might have, we'd hash out with Jim, and then Jim would come up with a final version. Everything that we included in the scripts for the Sabbath video was very well documented. In fact, there were a lot of stories that we found interesting and we'd have loved to include it, but if we couldn't find thorough enough documentation and credible sources, we left those out. And that was important to us, that the whole series would be so well documented that anyone could find the same sources, and that anyone watching it or reading the scripts wouldn't have to question whether it was true or not. We wanted to show this series on television. We wanted it to be used as broadly and widely and for as many people as possible. We wanted a host that would be credible and would be able to give the information in a way that had great impact. So we went to a casting agency and described the kind of person we were looking for. They sent us a list of names that we narrowed down. We sent a copy of the outline to 25 people. Hal Holbrook was one of the first people to respond that he was interested in doing it. So then we sent him the whole outline of all 5 parts, and to let him know that there were that many parts and we'd want him to do them all, and also to make sure that he'd be comfortable with all the material and be willing to do all of them. And he was interested. We made him the appropriate offer, and he agreed to do it for us. The number of hours of work, the number of people involved, the amount of talent and ability and means and energy that has gone into this production is beyond anything I would have ever imagined. And yet I can see God's hand from beginning to end. He provided everything that was needed, from Jeff directing and producing, Jim writing and researching and finding all the experts, Cindy helping with production, Justin Ammon helping with editing, Robert doing the office management, Paul Zank on the camera, and many, many hundreds of other people. And yet all the way from beginning to end, we've seen God's hand in it. He has provided the right people. He provided the means. He provided the talent. Everything He provided. Because the Sabbath is an international subject, and because we're eager for the material to be shown all over the world, we decided to produce the Seventh-day series in at least 12 or 13 languages, the languages that the majority of people on this earth speak. Initially, besides producing in English with Hal Holbrook, we also produced it in Spanish with Pastor Frank Gonzalez as the host. It's been translated so far into Chinese, Arabic, German, French, Russian, Romanian, and it's also being worked on in other languages as well. I look back and think how Jim and I used to laugh and say, when this is done, we'll know who did it. And I look back on it now and I know who did it. I have watched God accomplish this job.